Chapter 3. Silent Silas. Silent Silas stood lined up at the end of his pallet bed at the end of the room. His sheets folded, his nightwear packed away neatly in a lockbox at the base of his pallet. He wore leather fingerless gloves, rags, and a flat tweed cap, looking the very image of a street rat. Next to him was Cinderella, a pretty young girl wearing the same outfit with the addition of a dirty red scarf hiding half her face and short dark hair. The workhouseman strolled into the room. A dozen beds with children lined up military style in front of him. He assessed each one as he walked past, making sure that not a single thing was out of place. As he approached the center of the room, he noticed one child had kicked his nightwear under his pallet instead of folding it. He bent down till he was eye to eye with the boy.
"You think I wouldn't notice, boy?"
He said in a voice that clearly dictated his intelligence. The boy started to sob as the workhouseman grabbed a big, thick leather blackjack from his back pocket.
"Hold out your hands, boy."
The boy shook and sobbed as he lifted his hands up in front of him. With a clack, the workhouseman slapped the blackjack down on the boy's hands. He squealed in pain, sobbing loudly as he pissed his pants.
"Are you kidding me?"
The workhouseman said angrily as he slapped him again even harder. He grabbed the boy by the scruff and threw him towards the door.
"Go wash up, and when you're done, you can scrub me floors you just soiled."
As the boy turned to leave, the workhouseman addressed the rest of the children in the room, making sure the boy heard him well.
"I know one boy who won't be eaten tonight,"
he said, looking back at him. Utterly defeated, the boy left the room, tears streaming down his face. The room was deadly silent. The rest of the children tensed as the workhouseman walked past. He stopped to inspect a child's bedding when Silas noticed a food wrapper tucked under Cinder's pallet. Silas took 2 rocks out of his pocket and threw them at the door at the other end of the room, just behind the head of the workhouseman. They hit the door, one after the other, making an audible knock, knock as they hit.
"Eh?"
The workhouseman said.
"Who is it? I'm busy."
No answer came, and he walked briskly to the door and opened it, looking bewildered. But he saw no one, and grunted as he slammed it shut. Silas used the distraction to quickly move over to Cinder's bed pallet and shoved the wrapper in his pocket. He moved back into position just as the workhouseman turned around to continue his inspection. He noticed 2 stones on the ground and picked them up. He looked around the room slowly, then thought to himself,
"Surely not. I doubt they're smart enough for that, or would even dare."
He dropped the rocks near the door as the boy from earlier came back with a bucket of water and a rag.
"Clean those up too, piss pants,"
the workhouseman said to him. Cinder smiled at Silas and mouthed a silent thank you. Silas slightly bowed his head and smiled back. The workhouseman turned to leave, and as he walked out, he said,
"Work starts in an hour. You work in the market this morning. Remember, if you're caught, you ain't from here. I don't need to tell you what happens if you cause trouble."
The children of the workhouse did all sorts of work for the workhouseman, and in return, they got a roof over their heads and 1 meal at night, usually consisting of an assortment of what they stole that day. Things like fruit and bread were usually an easy steal. Things like meat were more difficult, as the children didn't have anywhere to cook, so they'd have to steal it prepared. If you managed that, you were considered a hero in the workhouse. The children who were caught were severely beaten by the town guardsmen. Some lost their hands and were no longer welcomed back to the workhouse. Those that ratted out the workhousemen were usually never seen again, usually killed, sold as slaves, or imprisoned and sent to mine the pit. Silas walked over to the door and picked up the rocks he threw earlier. He put them back into his pocket.
"You're mad,"
said Cinder, shaking her head. Silas just smiled at her and walked out the door. They convened in the marketplace a little while later. The workhousemen sat at a stall at one end, selling various wares that were probably stolen. Once a week at dawn, the city of Ravenhill had a street market. Vendors would use the stalls the city provided to hawk their wares. Silas was always excited to see what new things were for sale. The smell of food permeated the air. Market day was always the best day of the week, as it was the day the children of the workhouse had ample food to eat.
Okay, kids. Time to go play,
the workhouseman said, and a dozen children scattered in every direction. Cinder and Silas started walking down the main street, checking out the stalls for any sort of blind spots. Cinder saw a fruit vendor talking to a customer, laughing. She used the distraction to pull a fishing line with a fish hook and sinker on one end from her pocket. The other end looped around her middle finger. She deftly flicked it out and hooked an apple in a basket on the ground out of sight of the vendor. She pulled it back and caught it, quickly pocketing it in a deep coat pocket.
Nice one,
Silas quietly muttered.
Easy pickings,
she said with a shrug of her shoulders. As they walked down the street, she took a bite out of the apple. Silas bumped into a man and spun around, pocketing a bag of coins. The man looked back at him and shouted,
"Watch your step, rat!"
As he walked off, Silas lowered his hat and didn't turn back to him, as he didn't want the man to see his face, and kept walking. Cinder skipped ahead, excited.
That was amazing. That will keep the gargoyle happy for the rest of the day,
she said. She sometimes called the workhouseman a gargoyle due to his unpleasant, angry demeanor and horrendous looks. They spent the next few hours snatching food, jewelry, and coin and delivering it to the workhouseman's stall, where he threw it in compartmented barrels behind the stall with false tops. One part lifted a lid on top, the other part lifted the whole false top, revealing the goods at the bottom in case the city guards came snooping around. Silas noticed a stall of meat skewers that smelled particularly good, so he approached it.
I'd like 20, please.
He addressed the vendor, who looked at him with an eyebrow raised.
I can pay,
Silas said as he laid some of the coin he had stolen earlier on the counter. The man's expression changed to a happy one.
Right away, little sir,
he said with a wry smile, and wrapped them up in a paper bundle. As they walked away, Cinder was nervous.
If the workhouseman catches you using his coin, you'll be done for,
she said. But Silas didn't care. He knew that he would be a hero to the rest of the children in the workhouse, so he thought of an elaborate ruse he'd tell the workhousemen of how he acquired the food. At the end of the day, they reconvened at the workhouseman's stall and helped him roll the barrels back to the workhouse. They unloaded their haul, and the workhouseman took the coin and jewels and the lion's share of the good food, returning to his quarters at the start of the haul. The children were left with a banquet of food stolen from the marketplace. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and even a cooked meat skewer for each child. They feasted well and told each other the story of how they acquired each of the goods. Silas told his lie about how he acquired the meat skewers, and the children cheered aloud, patting him on the back. Cinder just looked at him, arms folded, smiling, and whispered,
"You're so full of shit, Silas."
He smiled at her warmly. The next morning, the workhouseman did his usual inspection. The children lined up, beds made, clothes folded neatly. He stopped in front of Silas and bent down to look him in the eye.
I had a good yarn to me mate at the market. He said a boy of your description bought some of his wares yesterday.
Silas showed no expression, but inside he was furious at the betrayal.
I'll show you what happens when you waste me coin, boy.
He pulled out the leather blackjack. Silas showed no expression of fear. He didn't even blink.
It was me,
Cinder said. Silas's eyes grew wide with fear as the workhouseman turned to her. anger on his face. He swung across with the blackjack to strike her face, but Silas was fast. He leaped and grabbed his arm, swinging with the blow, slowing it down significantly. Cinder ducked and it missed. The workhouseman grabbed Silas in both arms and slammed him into the wall. Cinder took her fishhook out of her pocket and began spinning it.
You done, boy. I give you everything, and you betray me for this girl? You'll be working the pit till you drop.
The gargoyle said. Cinder flicked her fishhook under his far shoulder and pulled it, making the gargoyle cry out in pain. He dropped Silas to the floor and turned. He grabbed the line and pulled Cinder in, slapping her face so hard she hit the floor in a daze. He pulled the hook from his shoulder.
To hell with both of ye.
He grabbed them both by the back of the shirt and hauled them off to another room. He threw them inside and locked the door, then returned to his daily inspections. The rest of the children had their heads down, burning with anger. Silent Silas was a hero to them, and a source of hope in an otherwise dark and abject existence.
I had it under control.
Silas said to Cinder.
I'm sorry. I couldn't let you take the fall after what you risked for us. For me.
After a while, she said,
What's going to happen to us now?
Like you said, probably the pits for hard labor until I die. For you, probably a slave to some old perv.
Silas replied. Cinder cringed and slumped against the wall. A few hours later, the workhouseman returned with a tall and lanky old man dressed in a black suit with the emblem of the Church of the God-Feared on it and a wide-brimmed black hat. Silas and Cinder stood to face them.
Interesting specimens. Are they any good?
The lanky man said in what could only be described as a devious but well-spoken manner.
They both got me some coin. More so the boy. But the girl has some interesting skills.
The gargoyle said. He looked them both up and down.
I'll take them,
said the tall man, handing over a bag of coins.
You'll be coming to live with me now. My name is Malachor. There's a carriage waiting outside. Come along,
he said, turning to leave. Silas and Cinder looked at each other confused, then headed off for him down the hall.
What does a rich-looking man like him want with us?
Cinder whispered.
He's probably going to have his way with us, then kill us.
Silas replied. They stepped outside, and waiting for them was a horse-drawn carriage. Malachor offered them a hand up to get in, then shut the door and turned to speak to the workhouseman.
Maybe this won't be so bad,
Cinder said. Silas looked out the window.
They always treat the animal well before they slaughter them.
Malachor finished his conversation and hopped into the carriage.
Well, what are your names?
Malachor asked. Cinder responded in a friendly manner.
Cinder Krala.
She offered a hand. Malachor kissed the back of her hand, which made Silas sneer.
And you?
He addressed Silas.
Sound Silas,
he said shortly. Malachor sat back in his seat and signaled the driver. They began to move away from the workhouse. Silas stared out the window for most of the trip, while Cinder made small talk with Malachor. They pulled up at a large house at the other end of Raven Hill. Malachor helped Cinder down from the carriage, while Silas leaped down behind her. The house was beautiful. It was like nothing they ever had the privilege to see before. They moved down a long path and through a meticulously groomed garden, then inside the house.
Line up,
Malachor ordered, and they did as he asked, just as they did for the workhousemen every morning, hands by their side and still.
The discipline is there. At least the idiot taught you to respect orders.
Malachor looked them over.
Let's play a little game. I'll ask you a question or give you a task. If you get it right, you will be rewarded handsomely. If you get it wrong, however,
He quickly revealed a knife and threw it in between the eyes of a taxidermized elk head on the wall. Both Silas and Cinder's eyes widened, and they shifted nervously.
Let's begin.
Malachor said as another knife seemingly just appeared in his hand.
Who do you serve?
Cinder and Silas looked at each other. Silas replied first.
Yes, sir.
He stammered. Malachor slashed Silas across the face. Silas cried out in pain and dropped to a knee, holding his face. Cinder reached into her pocket only to realize she no longer had her hook. Malachor held the knife out to her throat, and she stopped still.
Get up, Mr. Silas. The correct answer was Lord Guldamir or the Church of the God-Fear. I only gave you a shallow cut for being half wrong. Try not to make such mistakes again.
Malachor said, glaring at them. Silas stood up, and Malachor gave him the handkerchief to hold against his bleeding face.
Don't make a mess of my floor, Mr. Silas. And don't be too hasty. I wouldn't want you to bleed out on your first day here.
Malachor said. Silas and Cinder stared at him, horrified of what would happen next. Malachor paced in front of them, waving the knife around. He dropped another knife from his suit sleeve into his free hand, and it seemed like it just appeared out of nowhere.
You'll live quite comfortably here, provided you do as I instruct. I do not tolerate failure. You will be here in training until I deem you are ready, or until you die. In return, you will pledge your allegiance to me and the Church of the God-Feared.
Malachor explained, and with a flash the knives disappeared from his hands.
Again,
He shouted.
who do you serve?
Both Silas and Cinder replied quickly in unison.
Lord Guldamir.
Malachor smiled.
Well done. Your reward is upstairs.
He signaled for a servant in black robes.
Escort them to their rooms. Your clothes are laid out on the bed. Dinner will be ready in an hour.
He pointed to one of the robed waiting staff.
Oh, and tend to Mr. Silas's wound, would you?
He ordered. Malachor left the room, and the two are escorted to beautiful rooms with four-post beds and clean sheets. On the bed, Silas found a suit, a black outfit, and a black coat with a dozen knife holsters. Cinder found the same, and also a beautiful evening dress. A female servant helped stitch the wound on Silas's cheek. He fidgeted the whole time, and the servant became frustrated with him.
So, what does Malachor do to afford a place like this anyway?
He tried to ask the servant, but she just smiled, collected her things, and left the room without saying anything. Later that night, they sat down at a long table with shiny silverware. Food laid out in front of them, and servants standing by, ready to serve. Malachor walked in briskly to join them, and stood at the end of the table, placed his hands together in prayer, and urged them to do the same.
We praise Almighty Guldamir, he who raised us from the dead after the calamity. He alone who gives us life and provides for us, who protects us all. Amen.
Malachor took his seat, which was much more ornate than their own, and began eating his meal. Silas and Cinder sat quietly waiting.
Eat.
Malachor said, looking at them curiously.
You'll find it quite adequate.
He took a mouthful of food and groaned with pleasure at the taste of it. They began eating and were very impressed with the food. They looked at each other, eyes wide, and happily began scoffing the food down. Malachor asked them of their days in the workhouse, and what the workhousemen had them doing, and stories of their best work. They were having a wonderful time talking and laughing. Silas suddenly vomited up his food in a puddle of black mush. Looking shocked, Cinder tried to ask him what was wrong, but then did the same. They both looked at Malachor.
You poisoned us?
Malachor smiled wickedly.
Well, I'm feeling fine.
He shrugged as he continued to eat unfazed. Silas and Cinder fell to the floor in pain as Malachor finished his meal.
Oh, it's only a little poisoned. Don't be such babies.
he said as he wiped his mouth and got up.
Help our guests to their rooms and have them bathed.
He said as he left them on the floor. The servants picked Silas and sent her up and dragged them out of the room. The next day, after a horrid night of endless stomach cramps, a servant came to greet them and get them ready for the day, only to find Silas and Cinder already awake, standing at attention at their doors. He then returned to Malachor.
Well, where are they?
He said to the servant.
Your protégé are waiting for you to inspect them.
He said in a posh, impressed voice. Malachor spat out some of his breakfast into a napkin and got up quickly, rushing upstairs. He saw the pair standing there and laughed.
Ha ha! While I do appreciate your discipline, it is not necessary here. Come downstairs,
he said, amused. They followed him downstairs and onto an outside balcony with a small round table. There was tea and an assortment of breakfast foods ready for them. Malachor sat and began drinking his tea, and they sat nervously without touching the food. After a while, Malachor put down his tea and explained.
Look, last night was an error on my part. I didn't account for the fragile nature of children and put too much poison in the food. It won't happen again.
Too much poison?
Cinder exclaimed.
Any poison is too much poison,
Silas said angrily. Malachor, looking very unimpressed, glared at them. They moved nervously, awaiting punishment, but he calmed down.
I'm dosing you with small amounts of different poisons in order for you to build up tolerance to them. Can't have my artists in training dying from something as pathetic as poison now, can I?
Malachor explained. Cinder and Silas looked at each other horrified and nervously picked at the food in front of them. A few moments later, a servant came by and whispered something into Malachor's ear. He then excused himself and left the two alone.
Who's trying to kill us?
Cinder whispered.
We'll leave tonight, while everyone is asleep.
Cinder nodded her approval. They explored the grounds around the house that day, accompanied by a servant. There were many training grounds surrounding the property, such as an archery range and a fighting pit, with an accompaniment of many different types of weapons. They both kept an eye out for places to hide and escape routes for later on. Later that night, Cinder sat in her room, feeling queasy from dinner. She heard 2 knocks on the wall, then slowly opened her door. Silas did the same. They snuck out quietly and closed the doors behind them. They creeped down the stairs and toward the front door. They opened it and moved to leave, but as soon as Cinder took her first step down the stairs, a rope came down from a balcony above her. It twisted around her neck and lifted her up into the air, choking her. Silas moved to grab her, but a knife flew down and speared him through his shoe, pinning him to the ground beneath. Silas cried out in pain as he looked up to see Malachor hanging upside down on the railing above them. Rope in hand, he let go of the railing, and Cinder was pulled upward toward the balcony. Malachor landed smoothly in front of Silas, and with a flash, his knife was in his hand at Silas's cheek.
Romantic midnight rendezvous? Were you trying to betray me?
Silas spotted, but he couldn't make out his words through the pain in his foot.
I'd think again if you thought you could escape the master assassin of the Thieves Guild.
He slashed Silas's face with his knife, giving him yet another wound. Silas stood there shaking, too afraid to move as blood ran down his face. Malachor handed him a handkerchief to stop the blood.
Don't let me catch you two fooling around again, or you'll have more than just a few cuts on your face.
He warned, dropping the rope. Cinder came down as Malachor pulled the knife from Silas's foot and pushed him forward. She fell on top of him and they both hit the ground. Cinder, choking and gasping from the rope, now loose at her neck. Servants came out to clean up the mess and dress their wounds, helping them into the house. Later that night, Cinder approached the wall between their rooms.
Silas?
She said softly behind tears.
Yeah?
I think for now, it's best we do as he wants, until we're strong enough to fight back.
A moment passed, then Silas replied.
Okay.
They went to bed sore and sorry, not knowing what tomorrow might bring. A few years later, Sal and Silas and Cinderella stared at each other at either end of the fighting pit. Silas's face now covered in scars, while Cinder had none. Malachor and a few servants watched from the parapet. Cinder dropped a heavy blade tied to a rope to the ground. One end wrapped around her left hand, the other tied to the blade. She lifted it and began spinning it around. Silas flicked his wrists, and 2 knives appeared in hand out of the sleeves of his coat. Cinder turned with the weight of the blade and wrapped it around her elbow. She straightened her arm and the blade shot out towards Silas. He dodged left, slapping the flying blade away with his knife, then threw his other knife towards Cinder as he dashed to close the distance. Cinder did a pirouette out of the way, the knife shooting past and slamming into the wooden wall behind her. She pulled on the rope and the blade came rebounding back to her. Silas narrowly avoided being hit in the back of the head by throwing herself to the ground. Another pirouette, and she used the momentum of the blade to bring it around for a vertical strike. Silas rolled to the side, avoiding it. He threw his other knife at Cinder, and with yet another pirouette she dodged. The knife stuck into the wooden wall behind her again. Cinder pulled the rope and swung the blade above her head. Silas rushed to close the distance, and with a flash 2 more knives were in hand. Cinder then threw the blade in a wide arcing low swing. Silas smiled as he thought the blade went wide, but she pulled the rope through her hand and it sped up, coming in short and wrapping around his ankles. The heavy blade entangled itself, slamming into Silas's leg, giving him a small gash at his ankle. Cinder pulled the rope, pulling Silas off his feet. She ran at the wall and kicked off, leaping over her support beam above them. She sprinted towards Silas, and the speed of her movement dragged Silas past her, then lifted him upside down, hanging by the rope. She quickly wrapped the rope around a weapon rack fixed to the wall, then dusted her hands up, smiling at Silas, who was looking quite pathetic, hanging upside down. Silas sighed, then grabbed his legs and pulled himself up enough to grab the top of the rope. He cut it, then dropped to his feet. Cinder made a mental note to use an iron chain next time as Silas threw a knife at her. She turned her body, narrowly avoiding the blade as it struck into the wall near her face. Silas moved in to attack and Cinder grabbed a spear from the weapon rack. She stabbed at him, but Silas turned around the spear tip, flicked the knife upside down, turning his hips back to her and cut the head off the spear. Cinder jumped backward as Silas approached. He slashed to her face and she blocked it with the end of the spear that was now just a staff. She stabbed at his face, but he turned again in the opposite direction and cut off even more of the staff. She stabbed again, and even more staff was shortened, until she only held a small piece of wood. Silas smirked at her, amused, and she smiled, throwing it at him. With a flash, 2 knives appeared in her hands. They came together, slashes seemingly coming from every direction, sparks flying as daggers collided. They came to a stop with Cinder's knife at Silas's throat.
Enough!
Malachor called from the parapet. They stood side by side and bowed to the master assassin.
That will do for today. I have a few tasks I need you to complete.
The 2 trainee assassins met Malachor on the parapet, and he handed them both an envelope.
Assassination missions. Your targets are inside. Be sure you are not seen.
They nodded and moved to their rooms to prepare. Cinder spoke up.
You're still letting me win, aren't you?
Barely. You don't want to end up with a face like mine, do you?
He smirked at her, scars covering his face.
He wouldn't dare scratch this face. It's too important to his missions.
She said, begrudgingly.
Is he still making you seduce your targets?
Silas said sadly. Cinder sighed, looking disgusted.
I think it's time we put an end to this farce. Let's do it tonight, after the missions.
Do it?
Silas replied with a cheeky grin.
You know what I mean, Silas. Silas.
Cinder drew her thumb across her throat. Silas's face became sullen.
Do you think we can? He's always been 2 steps ahead of us.
We're stronger now. We can beat him together.
Cinder said as she looked at him with hope in her eyes. They stopped outside their rooms, and she kissed him passionately.
I'll see you tonight. Don't die on me.
Cinder said as she entered her room. Later that evening, as Silas got ready for his mission, Malachor knocked on the door.
Mr. Silas, I have a request for tonight's mission. I'd like you to wear this costume. It's a mask and terry clothes from the Thieves' Guild. If you're seen, people will think you're one of them and not one of us.
Sure.
You read the dossier on the target?
Malachor asked. Silas nodded.
This will be no ordinary target. You'll be fighting a professional. So don't hold back. Report to me once the deed is done.
Silas bowed and headed off to the location noted in the dossier. Moving down back alleys, always sticking to the shadows, he arrived at the location. A steel mill used for fabrication work. He moved inside through a sliding door. It was dark inside, and as he entered, a thin steel chain came down from a walkway above and wrapped around his neck. The unknown assailant jumped down and Silas was lifted up, choking from the chain. He swung himself back and forth as he struggled, then kicked up the door, flipping upside down. He grabbed the chain and planted his feet on the bottom of the walkway, then pulled hard. His assailant was pulled over the railing. They both landed on the ground hard. Silas removed the chain from his neck, and with a flash, his knives were in hand. He moved to attack. His assailant was wearing a mask similar to his own, but his assailant walked backward into the shadows and disappeared from sight. Silas stopped and listened carefully, but could hear only silence. A sickle on a chain flew out at him, arcing low from the right. He jumped to avoid it as it wrapped around a pillar on the other side of the room. Silas threw a knife in the direction of the attack, but hit nothing, hearing the clang of the knife bouncing on the floor. Again, the room was silent. From the other side, another chain sickle arced around his midsection. Silas bent backward to the floor, narrowly avoiding it as it wrapped around another pillar. He flipped onto his feet. Silas, realizing he walked directly into a trap, looked around, scanning the darkness. He was illuminated by moonlight through glass windows at the top of the warehouse, but the walls of the room were shadowed. He heard running steps as he launched a volley of throwing knives into the darkness around the room. Another chain sickle arced out low from behind. Silas jumped it as it wrapped around another pillar, chains now crisscrossing around the room. He heard a lever crank at the far end of the room, and the large steel mechanical pulley began to spin. All 3 chains pulled tight, and the sickles tore free of the pillars. All 3 blades arced around Silas. He couldn't avoid them all, so he jumped high. The lowest chain missed, but he was caught around the arms and ankles by the other 2. The sickles wrapped around him and dug into his flesh. He hit the ground hard and was dragged toward the pulley wheel. As he drew close to the pulley, he flicked a knife into the gears and it slammed to the hole. His assailant walked out of the shadows with a knife in hand to finish him off. Silas turned so his back was facing his assailant. He managed to wiggle an arm free, loosening the chains. He pulled out a knife and rolled quickly toward his target. Using his free arm, he launched the knife at blistering speed into the assailant's chest. His opponent let out a breathy scream and fell back against a nearby pillar and slid to the ground. Silas took out the sickle with pained grunts, freed himself from the chains. He limped over to his assailant and removed the mask. Cinder looked at him, blood trailing from her mouth. Silas's eyes grew wide with fear as he shouted,
Cinder? No.
He took off his mask and frantically thought of a way to help her.
Silent,
She whispered.
as usual. He was 1 step ahead of us.
She reached into a pocket and pulled out her dossier, handing it to Silas. She coughed up more blood, and Silas held her in his arms, tears forming in his eyes as she took her last breath. Silas screamed in grief and anger.
I'll kill him. I'll kill him if it's the last thing I do. Damn you, Malachor!
Silas laid Cinder gently on the floor and ran back to the house. When he arrived, Malachor was waiting for him, wearing his assassin's black coat and his wide-brimmed hat with his knives in hand.
You dirty, rotten bastard. You'll pay for what you've done.
Mr. Silas, you're the one who killed Cinder, not me. This is your punishment for plotting to kill me. Surely you didn't think your actions would not have dire consequences.
Malachor replied in a calm yet sinister voice. Silas screamed out in anger and charged at Malachor, slashing at him. Malachor returned each slash with one of his own. Daggers sparked as they collided, each fighter's blade ripping holes into the other's body, blood spurting over the walls from every wound inflicted. They started to slow as the pain and bleeding compounded. Malachor laughed as he shoved a knife into Silas's side. Silas's fury gave him strength, and he returned the favor, shoving his knife into Malachor's chest.
It seems you're finally prepared to serve.
Malachor said as he fell towards Silas. Malachor took off his hat and put it onto Silas's head.
For 4 centuries, I've done his bidding. Now that I've found a suitable replacement, he will finally let me die.
Malachor said as he collapsed to the ground. Silas looked down at him.
See you in hell, Malachor.
He said, dropping to his knees. Blood gushed from wounds all over his body. His vision blurred as the light in the room shrunk, as if being squeezed by the dark. A dark figure in tattered black robes walked into the room and held out a skeletal hand. The world turned black, and Silas fell into a dark river flowing rapidly, flowing fast. He moved with the current, not made of water, but of a ghostly representation of water. He could see at the end was a waterfall, and beneath, an abyss of darkness. Malachor smiled at him and drifted soundly off the edge, smiling the entire way. A large black-clawed hand reached in and grabbed Silas out of its heart, pulling him from the brink of death. Moments later, Silas opened his eyes. His bleeding had stopped, but his wounds were still fresh. He groaned in pain as he was addressed by the figure in black.
I won't let you just die.
A raspy voice spoke to him. He blinked blurry eyes a few times and regained his vision. A half-rotted skeleton covered with a smoky black miasma and golden pupils stood before him. He knew who this man was, though he had never met him before.
I will offer you a deal in return for your service.
Who are you?
Silas asked, weakly.
I am your savior. I can bring her back to you.
Silas's eyes opened wide.
Anything you want. Just bring it back.
Good.
The lich cackled and pulled Silas to his feet using a black miasma claw.
Firstly, you must find for me a source of power. One lost long ago. Only then will I have the power to raise the long dead from the abyss. Only then will your beloved Cinder be by your side.
Guldamir offered a hand, and Silas took it.
I will. Thank you, Lord Guldenir.
Many years later.
Master Silas, there's been a disturbance at the tavern. Your skills are required.
A raven made of black miasma spoke to Silas, and he stood up from his writing table, slowly putting on a black, wide-brimmed hat. Walking outside, he climbed into a carriage with a groan. Old wounds still punished him from his fight with Cinder and Malachor all those years ago. He wrapped Cinder's red scarf around him and tucked it into his coat as they headed downtown. Silas saw a strange-looking cart pulled by a carabook, half cart and half boat. He stuck his head out the window and lifted up his hat as a heavily wounded man with 2 children rode within it. He locked eyes with the youngest child and smirked, taking note of them as he passed. Arriving at the scene, he saw a harem half-born climbing up from the wharf, covered in wounds and sopping wet. He laughed heartedly at Harem.
Piss off, Silas.
Harem sputtered, still covered in seaweeds. Silas chuckled.
Wanna tell me who's responsible for this?
Harem shook himself off like a dog.
One by the name of Allheart, and that Wynn guy. The one that owns the shop over there.
Harem grunted.
Thanks, Harem. I'll pay Wynn a visit.
Harem chuckled approvingly as he walked into the burned tavern from the hole he made earlier to get a drink. A bell rang, and Wynn looked over from the table he was still laying on.
We're closed,
he bellowed as Silas walked in. He attempted to get up, but no sooner did he move, a knife sunk into his hand. Wynn cried out in pain. Over the road at the tavern, Harem sat in what was left at the bar and heard Wynn's cry. He shuddered and took a swig of a drink from a broken bottle.
Glad I'm not you, friend.
We're gonna get to know each other a little better. You're going to tell me who your friend is, Allheart, or I'm going to start removing some of these fingernails,
Silas said with a smile.